Welcome to another edition of Author Showcase. My name is Matthew Kupak and I'm your host for today. Today we have a very special guest with us, an author. His name is John Hankins, and he's written a number of books. One of the books that we're going to talk about today is Cayman Gold. A few of the other books that he has written is Bouquet Island, Martha's Will, and Made of the Stones and More Poems. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
I'm glad that you came by. I've been reading a lot of information about your book, but first I'd like to talk a little bit about yourself, because you sound like a very interesting person with a very interesting personal history.
I guess my white hair shows a lot of it now, doesn't it?
Well, let's start off by saying that you were in the health industry.
Yes.
And you were an executive?
Yes.
What type of work did you do?
Well, I have been administrator of many hospitals. I've built a number of them, and currently I'm still in consulting business. People do call me now and then, but I'm not as active as I used to be. Altogether, I spent about 50 years in the industry.
You were doing administration primarily?
Yes, I've done a lot of other things. I'm, I guess, what you might call one of the first physician assistants, long before I ever got my degrees and before I got my commission in the military, and then returned to civilian life to practice my profession.
Now you have several degrees.
Yes.
Are they in management or arts?
They're in arts as well as in management.
Now, you also spent some time in the service.
Yes.
Were you in the Army? Or?
I have been in 3 different services. My first 2 years were, I was in the Merchant Marine. I was 16 when I entered. I made my 17th birthday at Saipan, my 18th at Okinawa. And I was finally old enough after the war, when I came back from the war, to join the Army. And I spent my next 8 years in the Army. And then between getting out of the service and going back to college and getting back in again, I returned to the Army, transferred to the Air Force, which saved my life, and ultimately retired.
Now you spent some time in Hawaii.
Yes, I was raised there.
You were raised in Hawaii, and,
yes.
And you lived there for a number of years?
Yes, I lived there for the first 13 years of my life. And I used to go to school in Middle Pearl Harbor, which was called Bouquet Island then. And this was an Army and Navy school where the Army and Navy brats used to fight all the time. And I saw Hickam Field built before it, when it was still sugarcane fields.
No, Hickam Field?
Hickam Field.
I'm not sure what that is.
It's interesting. See, when I look at you, I'm presuming that you're my age, and you're not. Yeah. But
when you said Pearl Harbor, the first thing I thought was the monument in Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
But
well, we used to watch from Pearl City, which is a little community around the bay that forms Pearl Harbor, and you could look at Fort Island, and we used to see all the battleships, Battleship Row, as we used to call it, and they would be tied up to their moorings. And there was nothing but sugarcane fields from where we lived all the way to downtown Honolulu. Then eventually they tore up the sugarcane fields and built Hickam Field, the one that you see in Tora. And we left Hawaii just about, excuse me, we left Hawaii about 4 months, maybe a little longer, before the war broke out.
And you moved back later, right? Because as I understand, you ran for governor of the state?
Oh, that was many, many, many years later.
Oh.
We came to the United States and the war broke out. Mm-hmm. And of course my father went back into the service. And then I waited a couple of years and I went in. And then after that, the world was my home.
Now, you had some honors bestowed upon you by the state, the Senate, was it?
Oh yes, the very last thing that happened to me before I left Hawaii this last time, I went there in 1983 to help for the state of Hawaii, the health department, to help them straighten out some of their hospitals. And I took over the big hospital on the island of Hawaii. The Hawaiian Islands are divided into a series of islands, and the biggest one is called Hawaii, for which all the islands are called Hawaiian Islands. And while I was there, I only went as a consultant, not expecting to stay, but they didn't want me to leave. And the next thing I knew is I was being honored by the Senate, the state of Hawaii, for outstanding services. And it wasn't long after that I decided I would, in view of what I saw of the political system in Hawaii, I didn't even want to be any part of it. Mm-hmm. So I thought I would just go ahead and run for political office. and I didn't feel I had time to waste like running for a smaller office, so I decided I would go for the governor.
But you were very interested in health reform at that time.
Yes, very, very much, because I saw the way the system was being handled over there, and I didn't like it.
So what is it about the health reform that you wanted to change?
Well, it's controlled by the state, for one thing, and one of the saddest things was that they had people in there who had no qualifications to do the jobs they were doing. They were people who would be like the director of health, a used car salesman, and former political appointee to the Board of Education who became the director of health. Now, if this is qualifications for handling something as serious as running hospitals on all the islands, I think that this is ludicrous.
So you gave it up and you came back to Houston.
Well, not right away. I didn't win and I didn't lose. It's because they found a way how to disqualify me.
Oh.
You needed a 5-year residency, and even though I was older than all the candidates and spent probably more time in the islands than probably most of them, it still wouldn't pass, and so I had to withdraw. But it was an interesting experience. I got a lot of people frightened, so I think they straightened their act up a little bit.
And now you have a brand new life. You're publishing your own works, your own books?
Yes, we came back to Houston. My wife is from Houston because her mother was ill, and unfortunately this lovely lady passed away right after we got here. So I had to do something, and I had been writing for years. I just hadn't ever pushed any of my books. This is only representative of a few books. And these are published, the others are not. And finally I decided I would deal with New York agents and others, and decided after a little while that it's not the place to go.
Well, you were trying to get into the New York publishing industry. What were some of the major problems that you found?
Oh, I got some very fine letters from some very well-known agents. They were just overloaded, some of them, and others were just too busy, or the subject matter was not the kind that they particularly handled, and things of this sort. And then after attendance at a number of local programs, I finally decided, well, why not? I'm used to being a CEO. I'm used to getting things done. I'm used to creating things. Why not go ahead and do my own? I don't see anything particularly spectacular about what they're doing, other than the fact that they got a lot more money than I, which of course counts.
So you've published how many of your own books so far?
What you're seeing there now represents 4 of the novels, and I have a script to Cayman Gold, a movie script, which is now under option to Hollywood. And there are a bunch of people who want to see it made into a major motion picture.
Let's talk a little bit about Cayman Gold. Okay,
Yes.
It sounds like there was a lot of research involved in creating this book, because I mean it's historical, but you use the word faction, which is a mixture of fiction and science fiction and nonfiction based on facts. Talk a little bit about that.
And imagination.
And imagine, yeah. But I mean, history needs imagination.
Right, exactly. Yes, it was. I was stationed with the Army of Occupation of Austria, Linz, Austria. And little did I know that of course this was Hitler's hometown. And little did I know that a lot of the Nazi criminals that you've been reading about over the years were in and around me everywhere I went. But I had no idea that someday I might write a book about about the Nazi era, and particularly about the goal. Nor did I realize that some years ago, when I was visiting U-505 in Chicago, which is a submarine that was captured by the Americans at the end of the war, just before the end of the war, that I would use it as a model for my book. And so I did a lot of research. It just struck me one day when I was in the Cayman Islands, and I was talking to an old gentleman and who had lived there for years, and a thought just crossed my mind. And I said to him, I said, Tom, were there any German U-boats in this area during the war? And he said, oh yes. He said, they were all over this place. And for some reason, that stuck in my head. And it wasn't long after that we were in Hawaii, and after I had completed my mission, I just felt, I've got to do something about this, because it kept coming back to me. So I went to the library in different places, and I would watch every movie I could see and the documentaries, and finally it struck me that, this gold, there's more gold out there. A lot of it's unaccounted for. We know that a lot of Americans stole a lot of the treasures. We know a lot of the foreign soldiers of other countries, allies, stole treasures, and there's still a lot more out there that's unaccounted for. So after reviewing some of the things I saw and read, I finally decided I would just start. And the interesting thing is I started with the script first. I wrote the screenplay first. Then I liked it so much, I said, this has got to be turned into a novel. So I went and wrote the novel. But now, by the time I wrote the novel, there were new characters, people who didn't just suddenly appear.
It was still growing then.
Yes.
Still the ideas.
And these are principal people. These are wonderful, exciting people.
Wow.
And I love them. I cried too when I lost them, you know.
Yeah.
But as I got to these people, I realized that when the book was finally finished, now I've got to go back and rewrite the script to include these characters. And that's how this book came.
Well, give us a little rundown about the plot and maybe a few of the characters involved.
Well, we know that at the end of World War II, the Nazis, and particularly the criminals, were trying to escape to the West. And all during the war and before the war, they had been taking treasures, gold, art objects, and other things, either from Jews or captured nations, and using them for their own benefit. And now that the war was against them, they were trying to salvage what they could and take them out of the country. And some of them were very successful. And in my view, as I looked it over, like the mine at Merkers, Germany, where it was a salt mine where they hid tons and tons of gold bars, something that you have seen in a model I brought with me, that there had to be a lot more, I felt. And so I decided I would create a story. I said, what would I do if I were in their shoes? How would I escape from this country? And I decided, well, one of the best and easiest ways would be to use the abundance of submarines that they had.
They had a lot of different types of submarines.
Yes, in fact, everywhere I go when I display the book or the program, I usually bring these plastic cases showing not only a mock-up of gold on sand, but also the type of submarines used by the Germans.
Now, there are three types of
there were more than that.
But I mean, the three that you brought, those three, are those U-2 boats?
Yes, U-boat means Unterseeboot.
Unterseeboot.
Under the sea boat. That's what it stands for. Unterseeboot. And there were a number of wonderful boats that they created, and one of the last ones was Type 21. It is not featured in my book, but I discuss it. And after the war, the Americans and the Russians, and it seems like everyone else, started copying that boat because it had many advanced features.
But the Germans were well known for their engineering.
Oh, they were absolutely great in what they did, and they created all kinds of inventive things, but unfortunately they did it with slave labor. And it's really tragic.
So the plot develops around the submarines getting the treasures out of Germany or wherever.
And the story now, in this particular case, the story begins in the Führer bunker when Berlin is just falling apart, and a meeting is set up between Hitler and by his right-hand man, Martin Bormann. I noticed that you didn't know who he was.
Yeah, I wasn't.
But he was his right-hand man, the power behind the throne. He was a very evil person. And he, in this book, he works up an arrangement with an SS officer who is renowned for his ability to take things from camp inmates. And they want to take the treasure, they want it out of the Reich Bank, which is falling apart, being bombed, and the Russians are all around them. And so they concoct a plan called Project U4R, Project U-Boat Fourth Reich. And then the idea is to take the gold out of the country, set up another Reich, and for those who are loyal to Hitler. And Hitler finally acquiesces, and the idea is to use it through U-boats. But there's a lot of specialties that go in here because I use modified U-boats, I use inventions, metallurgic type of inventions to make this possible.
Now, in the plot, you discuss the boats going towards the Caribbean?
Yeah, they're heading for the Caribbean with an idea. They're not certain which one of their hidden bases that they're going to go to, whether it's going to be Argentina or a friendly country.
Now did the Germans actually have bases in the Caribbean, or?
Yes, so there's a lot of material that has been written on the possibility of bases being in the Caribbean at different islands, And Argentina, we know, was very friendly, of course, to the Germans, and it was a refuge, place of refuge for Nazi escapees. And I was even reading something this morning that came through my organization that I belong to, which includes former U-boat commanders and sailors and so on, about the possibility of arrangements in Mexico, because Mexico was very isolated back in those times. And we know for a fact that there are a lot of German citizens settled in Mexico who were sympathetic to the Nazis, and the same applies to many other countries.
Now, what are some of the characters in your story?
I use a character by the name of Philip Northam, and he is an American stockbroker whose marriage is on the brink. He's too busy, and his wife is too busy, and she's a lovely model. They have a lovely 8-year-old daughter. And finally, in order to save their marriage, their doctor and others tell them, you know, take a prolonged vacation, get on your yacht, sail off to some Caribbean island, enjoy yourself. And so 50 years later, after the submarines had escaped, and we now find this American couple vacationing in the Cayman Islands when they accidentally uncover on one of the remote islands a treasure catch. I'm not so sure whether I should give all the secrets away.
Well, you know, I think everybody is really fascinated, though, about the treasures, because I think in the back of everybody's mind, it's like the lotteries. People think that if they go to the beach, they might find some pirate treasure or something washed across the shore.
Oh, they do that in the Cayman Islands all the time, looking for treasure.
Now, you know, when you're talking about the Caribbean, my mother had once said that she saw an article, and I'm not sure when it was, might have been in the 60s, that there were some people in Florida that said they actually saw German U-boats off the coast.
Yes.
Of Florida.
Yes.
And I thought, no, that's they couldn't get that close.
Oh, they were all over.
And you didn't hear that until years after the war.
That's sad, because there was a lot of blackout on information about U-boats, not to frighten the American citizenry, and but there was a tremendous amount of U-boat activity, and a lot of ships were sunk, particularly here in the Gulf of Mexico, and right off the Mississippi. And one U-boat, U-166, actually went up the Mississippi, and it sunk a lot of ships right off the coast. It was finally sunk, and it's still missing. No one knows where it is. They know where it was presumably bombed and sunk, but no one knows where it is. And yet there is some rumor around it that it had a base in Mexico, and it's so interesting because in this book I create a base in Mexico.
So your creations are a little bit based on the true facts of something that could have been a possibility.
I had no idea that I was so close to the truth. I was guessing. Yes. I would put two and two together and say, well, what would you do in this instance? In this case, instead of going to Argentina, I have them going to Mexico.
Now, talk a little bit about, you have a few other books that you have written. The other books, do they talk to the same situation about the war? Or, I mean, no. You do have Made of the Stones and more poems. Are those your own poems?
Yes, they are. I have a number of other books. This one, they all started in different ways. I will be having a sequel to Cayman Gold because some exciting news have come up again I've discovered on the internet. But getting to, for example, this one on Bouquet Island, would you believe that this started by a wasp sting?
You got stung?
I got stung. I was out working on the house, and it was a wasp nest, and it stung, and instead of putting coal on it, I forgot to put heat on it. My arm swelled to twice its size. I hopped in bed and laid there, and my active mind was just flashing all over the place. I said, what can I do in all this time? I can't stay in bed all day long. And all of a sudden it came to me how to write a new story. And so Martha's Bouquet Island is a result of this one, and it's about a young man who goes to sea, and I can trace my Merchant Marine days there. And I've been in one of the worst typhoons that ever hit Okinawa, and that was in World War II. I know what it's like to be like a cork. I've seen that ship make 45 and 50-degree lists and almost turn over. Well, this fellow encounters a similar typhoon. On his return journey, he's taken a job of border freighter to earn some college money, And he's on his way back, and they hit a terrible typhoon. And he decides to walk on deck like I used to and get swept by the wonderful salt spray. But this one was a little bigger than he anticipated because a wave knocks him over. And over the side he goes, and someone sees him, tosses him a life jacket. So days later, I mean, no one, they have to save themselves, they can't save him. So there he's floating in the sea for a few days, and next thing we know, he wakes up, he's barely alive, and he sees a little bunch of sharks circling him, trying to decide whether it was time for dinner or not. And just about that time, the whole sea just comes apart.
So you've spent a lot of time at sea then yourself?
Oh yes, I spent 2.5 years at sea.
Do you miss it, or do you still
I
go
love
down
the
to
sea.
the Gulf?
It was great. It was a great life, but it gets boring, especially in the Pacific during World War II when you have no place to go. And of course, you're always looking to see if there are any pretty girls out there, but you know, you're far away from them.
Now, what about Maids of the Stones? Those are your original poems. What are are they just varied topics?
Well, I guess you might call me a multi-genred person. I just like any kind of subject, and I guess it's because of the places in the world I've been, the experiences I've had through life. And I wrote, Made of the Poems consist of 2 major parts. Part 1 is a story about, it's 35 pages long. It's an epic poem. I wrote it as a short story for my wife based upon an incident when we lived out in the country. And she said, John, you need to make this into a poem. So I've never written an epic poem. So I had to read the Iliad to get the gist of it, you know, and I sat down. And next thing I kept working on it. And so 20 years later, I finally said, I'm still not finished, but I need to publish it. So I created it. It's a story about a Roman centurion who is with Caesar as they invade England, early England. And the barbarians who attack them, who are naked and painted blue and their hair in clay, attack them, and he is almost killed by the chieftain. But he in turn gets the chief, and there's some very interesting rhyming words in here that goes along with this, which makes it more exciting. But then finally, they take a rest for the evening, and the chieftain's daughter offers to heal the centurion if they will give up the body of her father so they can give him the formal chieftain burial. And they allow her in, and of course later on, as the years pass, they fall in love. But then it has a very interesting, tragic end, one that will mystify you. Then the other poems in this one are to meet certain needs. Sometimes they're about animals, some are philosophical, some are on the spiritual basis, some are very simple. And it's just representative of some of the poems I've written.
Let's go back to Cayman Gold a little bit. Right now, I think in our time of history, in perspective to where World War II was 50 years ago, we have a type of resurgence of information about World War II. For instance, Spielberg's Private Ryan, and supposedly he did a lot of research. Yes. He talked to a lot of veterans. He had a lot of photos and footage that he can base it on, and it seemed to be a very successful film.
Yes.
Why do you think it's important? Some people think rehashing the past is really damaging. Why do you think there's an importance or an interest in that now?
It has to be brought out. It must continually be brought out because man's nature is not exactly very peaceful. If you study history from the very beginning, man has just been killing man for one reason or the other. In the name of God, I kill you. Who's God? And the neo-Nazi era was one of the worst in modern times. There were other massacres long before that. But the neo-Nazi era brings up hatred again. It divides people. It keeps them from understanding that they were all put on this earth by, if you would, some God. You know, for those who are religious or those who are non-religious would say, well, we were just an accident of birth. That might be so. Then that accident was very interesting because now we have Chinese, we have Japanese, we have Puerto Ricans, we have Mexicans, we have Norwegians, we have all kinds of races on this earth. And there must be some ultimate goal, and it seems to me the ultimate goal is peace.
Cooperation.
Yes, and that's the only way you can do it. But by having someone impose his will, as they did on Hitler, he was a egomaniac, and yet towards the end, even his own generals knew the man was crazy, knew he was incompetent, could no longer lead and could not lead. And yet they followed him right to the very end. And look at the millions and millions of people, Germans, that were killed because of this and were influenced by his rhetoric. And you find the same thing in Stalin era, the millions upon millions of people that were transported from one end of the country to the other and sent to the gulags and murdered. And you know, we can't allow this kind of thinking to go on. It's not right. It's wrong. The Hitler regime represents evil. Neo-Nazism represents evil.
And we've had some neo-Nazism here in the United States,
Yes.
And other hate groups. And the United States, of course, stereotypically is called the melting pot. I think it's really great that you're writing these topics, because I think you have to keep that in the forefront and even in the collective unconsciousness of the mind, so it doesn't happen again. Well, I think you're very successful at being self-published.
Well, I need to make some money at it now.
Are you going to be showing your books or having a booking opening, or is there a website that people can contact you at?
Yes. I have a website. It's www.wbcoa.com. And the book, in all my books, I do have the old website I have a new website now. And I'm getting ready to send out flyers to some of my previous clients and to new clients and other people that I know. I do make appearances at bookstores and at special gatherings. And in fact, I just came back not too long ago from the Cayman Islands, where I had another review down there. Of course, they're delighted because they want to see the picture made.
Are there local bookstores here that are carrying your books?
Yes, my books are carried by Borders, Barnes & Noble, and just about every bookstore that I know, the major bookstores. They're also on Amazon.com and Borders and Ingram's and so on. So I am carried.
Well, it sounds like you're on a successful trip into to publications. Are you going to be looking for some young artists that you could publish?
Well, before I answer that question, would you believe that all these things were done on a computer?
On your home computer?
And transmitted over the lines to the printer, and all he had to do was put it on his machine and print it, and the next day I had the finished copy.
That's great.
It's amazing what's happening
yeah.
in technology. Now, as far as printers and others, I'm not quite sure which direction this company is going to go. I put out a feeler, and I've told them, I've essentially said that it was founded by me to publish my books, but also to help other writers. And I'm not, at this point, I'm still at the embryonic level, and we're reaching out.
I'd like to thank you very much for joining us.
You're certainly welcome.
Thanks for joining us on another edition of Author Showcase, and join us again next week.